Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan LaPerla. I'm the interim co-director of New Canaan Library, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Authors on Stage program, which we're presenting with our local independent bookstore, Elm Street Books, who's here with us this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome Caroline Leavitt, whose most recent book, Is This Tomorrow?, has been received with high acclaim. I've just found out that the Independent Booksellers Association has named it the May Indie Next Pick. It received a starred review in Library Journal, and it was featured in People's Magazine, so surely it's an exciting and good book to read. So what is it about? What does it mean to be an outsider in a community? How do we keep the ones we love safe? In 1950s suburbia, everything is meant to be perfect, even as paranoia about communism and nuclear bombs winds its way through the supposed paradise. But when divorced, sensual without meaning to be, Jewish single mother Ava moves in with her 12-year-old son Louis, she struggles to fit in and find her place in the neighborhood. Louis finds solace only with the other two fatherless kids on the block, his best friends Jimmy and Rose. But when Jimmy vanishes one day, Ava comes under suspicion, and Rose and Louis are later forced to confront the truths they've long suppressed. Is This Tomorrow is a novel about people trying desperately to uncover secrets about the past and about themselves. Caroline Leavitt is the author of the New York Times bestseller Pictures of You and the award-winning author of 8 other novels. Ms. Leavitt always knew she wanted to be a writer, and she's been writing since she was a child. She teaches writing at UCLA and Stanford online, has private clients, and is a book critic for People magazine and the Boston Globe. She's married to Jeff Tamarkin, also a writer, and together they have a teenage son. So please join me in welcoming Caroline to New Canaan Library. And thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you all for coming on this really rainy, awful night. I really, really appreciate it. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and about where stories come from and about how it relates to my life. So Is This Tomorrow is actually a novel about paranoia, and it's about being an outcast. It's about Ava Lark, who is she has several strikes against her. First of all, she's a divorcee, and in the 1950s, that's a scandal. Second of all, she's Jewish, and she's living in a Christian community, and in the 1950s, that's very suspect. And third of all, she works. In the 1950s, women did not work. They took care of their family. She has a 12-year-old son, Louis, who quickly becomes friends with the only other 2 fatherless kids on the block, Rose and Jimmy. And one day, when Jimmy is over at Ava's house just playing checkers, he waves goodbye, he walks out of the outside, and he just vanishes. Now, things like that didn't really happen in the 1950s, not the way they do today. And the neighborhood is very paranoid because it's the Cold War era. And the neighborhood women get together and they decide that maybe someone who's responsible for it might be one of Ava Lark's many boyfriends. And the paranoia just grows. So a lot of people ask, like, where do stories come from? And for me, this particular story came from my childhood. I would have to say that I was probably an outcast from the time I was 5 years old. Like my character, I grew up the only Jewish family in a very Christian neighborhood in Waltham, Mass. My father believed in the American dream. He wanted to stay in suburbia. And when the realtor showed him houses, the realtor suggested that we live in Belmont or Lexington. And my father knew that was because that was where the Jewish people lived. But we couldn't afford Belmont or Lexington. So we ended up in Waltham, which at that time was very hardscrabble, very working class, very Christian. 10% of Waltham High School went on to college. The rest of the kids either joined the military or they worked in nearby factories. There was Brandeis University, but one of the things that the kids at Waltham High liked to do in the 60s was to go up to the university and beat up the students. So you can imagine that kind of milieu. So there I was at 5 years old, moved into my new house, standing at the front lawn waiting for kids to come by. And I see all these kids come by, and I got all excited. I thought, oh, great, great, great. These are friends for me. And I'm waving to them. The kids run by, and one of the kids looks at me and says, my father says that you killed Christ. So I was 5 years old. I didn't know who Christ was. I walked into the house and told my mom, and she said, some people just are ignorant. You just have to ignore it. But it wasn't so easy to ignore. In school, every day we had to say the Lord's Prayer. I had no idea what the prayer was. I just sort of mouthed the words. In third grade, my teacher, who I really liked, gave us all this test. The first question on the test was, name 2 of Jesus's apostles. And it got worse. Each question was worse and worse about Jesus and Mary and Joseph. I had no idea how to do this test. So I looked through the test and I took every name and I just put it in every single blank I saw. I turned in the test. The teacher called me up to her desk at the end of the day and said, Caroline, I'm very disappointed in you. You failed this test. You have to take this test home to your mother and have it signed. So I took it home to my mom, and I was really scared because my mother, education was a really big deal, and I knew she was going to yell at me for failing a test. But instead, my mother did this amazing thing. She looked at the test, and she drew herself up, and she said, you're coming with me because this is not right, and we're going to do something about it. We walked up to the school, into the principal's office. My mother showed him the test and said, how can you give a Jewish child a Christian test? The principal looked at it, and he looked at my mother, and he said, I can see that you people are sensitive. This grade won't count. So I knew that I was Jewish growing up. We celebrated the holidays. I had, we went to temple, but I never realized that I was supposed to be ashamed of it. But my friends made sure that I knew that. One of my best friends used to take me to her church, which was a Mormon church, every weekend. It was this big, noisy, welcoming place. And in fact, when the people at the church asked me if I wanted to join and convert, I sort of did, because it was a community and I wanted to belong. But of course, when I went home and told my parents, they quickly squashed that idea. They said, no, you're Jewish, you can't convert. So that was kind of disappointing. So when I was in junior high, it got even worse. They had this thing called the National Junior Honor Society. And the big thing about it was you got to wear these satin purple banners that said National Junior Honor Society. And they were really cool. And I wanted one of those banners so bad I could taste it. And all my friends wanted one too. So to get this award, you had to have all A's, which I had because I was very smart. And you also had to be in a lot of different activities, which I was in. I was in the drama club, the French club, the Russian club, every club. So the day before the ceremony, when my friends and I were so excited and all we could talk about were these banners, I was called to the principal's office. The principal had me sat down, and he said, Caroline, you're not going to be in the National Junior Honor Society. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, it's your grades. And I said, but I have straight A's. So he looked at my grades, and he said, well, if it's not your grades, then it's because you don't have enough activities. He said, why don't you join the drama club? And I said, but I am in the drama club. And he said, well, what about the French club? And I said, I am in the French club. And it went like that for 6 different clubs. And he finally said, well, you're not in it anyway, so you have to leave the office. So I went back to my mom, my hero, and once again she said, this is not right, and we're going to take care of it. She called up the school board, talked to the woman running the school board, told her what had happened, and the woman said, this happens every year, and it's always with a Jewish child. And my mother said, well, what are you going to do about it? And the woman said, nothing. There's nothing we can do. And this was during the early 70s or late 60s, and people did not sue for things back then, and so it just sort of disappeared. But on the day of the ceremony, I had to go to school, and I had to sit there in the auditorium with tears coming down my face as all my friends were getting up there getting that stupid banner. And 3 of my friends, as soon as they got the banner, they took it off. and they left the stage, and they came down to where I was sitting, and they gave me their banners. So it was kind of cool. So anyway, there was one other family in my neighborhood who was actually more outcast than I was. And it was a woman who was divorced. And even worse than being divorced, she was divorced from a Boston Celtics. So you can imagine how people hated her because of that. She was very sultry. She used to sunbathe in her front lawn in a bikini when all our moms wore two-piece. She had a lot of boyfriend, and she had 2 kids. One of them was my age, a girl named Annie. Now, none of her kids were supposed to go to her house because she was a divorcee, which was very bad. We were told the house was dirty, that there was no food, that there were all these strange men around, and it was just not a good place to be. But Annie was my friend. And I went over to the house, and it wasn't dirty, and it wasn't weird, and any man who was over there was perfectly polite and nice to me, but it didn't make any difference. Now, Annie didn't care that I was Jewish. In fact, she saw it as a plus because she babysat for a dentist over in Belmont who kept telling her that he was going to move to California, and he was going to adopt her. And I kept telling her, Annie, like, you have a family. Nobody's going to adopt you out of your family. And she said, yes, they are. So that night, I was in my bedroom, and I heard this commotion. And I looked outside, and I saw Annie and her mom were out in the middle of the street, this dark street. And all of a sudden, Annie's mom slapped her across the face so hard that she fell down on the ground. By the time I ran out to see what was going on, she was gone. And 2 days later, Annie left in a car with the dentist, with adoption papers. And 2 weeks later, her mom and her younger brother vanished. They just left the house with their belongings in there. And I remember I kept asking everybody, like, how could this happen? Where did she go? And my mother said to me, she's divorced. That's what happens when you're divorced. And I kept thinking about that and thinking about writing about that. So I started to write that story. And as I was, my novel before that, Pictures of You, suddenly became this New York Times bestseller, which was this amazingly cool thing. And it also became a tie-in for this show called The Killing. So I thought, well, if it's a tie-in with the show, maybe I should watch this show. Now, The Killing is a mystery, and I don't particularly like mysteries, or at least I thought I didn't, and I don't particularly read mysteries, and I thought, well, I sure as hell don't write mysteries. And I started watching this show, and I became completely obsessed. This show, if you've never seen it, you have to rent it, because it just grabs you in with the characters, and it leads you to believe that one character is the murderer, and you follow it along episode by episode, only to find out that it couldn't be that person at all. So I thought, well, maybe I can take this story of this outcast family and make it a mystery. And that's where the whole idea of little Jimmy leaving the house and vanishing came in. Now, I decided to set this story in the 50s rather than the 60s because I think the 50s is a much more bizarre time. It was a real time of paranoia and communism and this whole myth of the American dream in the suburbs. But to get everything right, I had to do a whole lot of research, and that's where the fun came in. First, I hired 2 high school students to help me. They were adorable, and they were terrible researchers. They just could not research anything. So I hired a professional researcher, and I went on Facebook. And I would post things up on Facebook like, is there anybody here who was a male nurse in the 1960s? Or is there anybody here who was a woman living in the 1950s? And I got zillions and zillions of responses. And I spent so much time talking to these amazing people with these really bizarre stories. Because my character, Lewis, becomes one of the first male nurses in the 60s. I talked to this guy who was one of the first male nurses in the 60s, and he told me that in the 60s, nobody would talk to him because men were not supposed to be nurses. That was a woman's job. So his sexuality was suspect. The doctors wouldn't talk to him either, not until they had a party, and he came in with a girlfriend, and then everybody sort of loosened up a little bit. But he also gave me these amazing details. details. Like in the 60s, doctors would smoke while they examined their patients. And not only would they do that, they would encourage the patients to smoke too, because smoking would relax you. So the hospitals were very, very different than they are today. I wanted Ava to have a job in an era where women didn't work. So I needed some kind of a job that a woman would do in the 50s. So I researched, and I found want ads from the 1950s, which just blew my mind, because they're divided in two sections: men's want ads and ladies want ads. Now, the men's want ads are like 10 pages of really interesting jobs that anybody would want to do. The ladies' want ads were a page at best, and they were all sort of very low-level jobs. But what was really interesting was the language. In the ladies' want ads, they would say things like, "Bring your feminine women's touch to Raytheon," or they would ask for secretaries who were pleasing, perky, and very, very pretty, which are things that you just couldn't do today. So I decided that what Ava should do was to be a cook, because that was women in the 1950s were supposed to be great cooks, but they certainly were not supposed to make a business out of it. But Ava was going to do that. So I had to research food of the 50s, and that was the most hilarious, appalling thing of all. In the 1950s, sugar was supposed to be very good for you. You were advised, commercials would advise you to give sugar to your kids because it would give them energy. Vegetables should be boiled for at least 45 minutes. And this was considered very healthy. I found all these vintage cookbooks with names like Let's Jump It Up with Jell-O, Cooking with Coffee, and Meals Men Like, because you were supposed to please your man. Now, men weren't supposed to cook. They can grill, because that's kind of caveman-y and he-manish. They can toss a salad, but they can't make a salad. That's for a woman. So here you have these women in the 50s, and they're home all day, and they're supposed to make meals memorable. First of all, because that's their job, to please their man. But second of all, because there was the specter of the secretary working with their husband. So they have to make these show-stopping meals. So I just want to share 2 recipes with you, which were very famous in the 50s. The first one was called a meatloaf train. You didn't just want to serve meatloaf to your man. What you would do is you take the meatloaf and you shape it so it looks like a train, and then you would cut the edges of carrots off so they look like little wheels, and you push the wheels into the meatloaf so it looks like a little train. And that's not enough. You have to take celery and cut the celery really thin so you can make little windows for your meatloaf train. And then you take peas and you make little bodies out of it and you stick those in the windows. Now, if you get really ambitious, at the end of the meatloaf train, you can make little tiny cabooses out of meat and have it attached by carrot wheels. And that's what you cook and you serve to your family. Another popular recipe of the 1950s was something called an overnight salad, and this was something you would serve to your guests. You take iceberg's lettuce, cut it all up, and then you pour on a cup of mayonnaise and a cup of heavy Wesson oil, and you leave it in the refrigerator overnight so it gets really soggy, and that's what you would serve to your family. And those are just some of the recipes. The other most important thing that I really researched was communism and paranoia. In the 1950s, people were deathly afraid of communists. They truly believed that communists were going to come into America, they were going to destroy our country, take our children from us, take our religion away from us, and that Iron Curtain would just slam down. And this paranoia developed because they also felt that the communists were going to bomb us and destroy us, and that there was nothing we could do about it. Magazines like Look or Time actually printed ways that you could tell how somebody was communist. And the ways were so paranoid and so weird. One of the ways you could tell a communist was if they used words of more than one syllable. If they read a lot, that could be a communist. If they told jokes that you didn't get, that could be a communist. If they were different from you in any way whatsoever, that could be a communist. Now, the weird thing about this paranoia, where all these people watching each other to see who was a communism and who wasn't, is people in the 1950s actually believed that they could survive an atom bomb. There were all these pamphlets about how to survive. Children were taught duck and cover drills in school. So if a bomb went out, the kids were supposed to duck under the desks, put their heads over their hands, and that supposedly would save you from a bomb. If you were out in radiation, Look magazine advised, just brush it off before you go in your house so you won't drag it in the house. Housewives were told to keep a really tidy house because clutter attracted radiation. In one of the more bizarre tidbits, they said that if an atom bomb went off and you wanted to know if there was fallout, open your window, take a white plate, put it outside, and leave it there for an hour. If there was any sort of fallout or debris on there, then you don't go out. But if there isn't, then it's perfectly safe to go outside and you can be okay. I'm going to just read for 6 minutes, just a little bit, just to give you a flavor of the book. And then I'm going to come back and tell you about how I became a writer and my adventures as a writer. So all you need to know about this passage is that this is just right after Jimmy has vanished and the neighborhood is just going crazy. And the cops are questioning Ava because she's being targeted because she's divorced and she spent a lot of time with this kid where all the other mothers didn't, and also because she had a lot of boyfriends. Okay, the cop nodded. Tell me about Jimmy, he said. I understand you two were friends. There it was. A lonely kid comes to her house, and she had kept him company, and suddenly she was guilty of something. He was my son's friend, she said. He was always at my house. But sometimes he was at your house when your son wasn't there. Isn't that right? Sometimes, she said. Anyway, lots of kids hang out in lots of houses. It's all open doors here. But not your door, I understand, the cop said. People say you lock your door. I used to live in the back bay, Ava said. I'm used to locking my door. She saw the flicker of surprise that somebody who had lived in the back bay might be reduced to living in a shabby house like this one. Sometimes he came over when Louis wasn't home and he wanted to sit around and wait for him, so we played checkers. Why wouldn't that be fine? Was it the way of the neighborhood mothers to play games with the kids, the cop said. Excuse me, Ava said. I'm asking because some of the mothers said they've seen you in the backyard playing cards with this boy for hours. Hours. That's a long time to be playing with a child who's not yours. What mothers? Who did you talk to? He raised his brow. Does it matter? We all took care of the kids, Ava said. We helped them with their homework. We played games. She knew it wasn't really true. She didn't want to mention the time she had overheard two kids talking, and one of them had said she wasn't allowed to go to Ava's house because it was dirty. Plus, she's divorced, the kids said. You know what that means. She knew the stories about her, and they were all horribly exaggerated. They weren't true. Louis had taken bread sandwiches to school once, just once, and suddenly they were a poverty case. What was so terrible about economizing, especially when she was trying to save enough to buy her house? Who knew how stories got started? When she had begun to hear the rumors about herself, she felt sick. The mattresses in her house, which she knew were old, were still clean, but everybody said they were stained. As if she would have stood for that. She was a Jew, and the neighbors said that all Jews had money, and if she seemed poor, it must just be because she was cheap, and everybody said that that was something else that all Jews were. The neighbors say you keep to yourself, the cop said. That's right. Ava didn't tell him how hard she had tried to socialize. She had thrown a party the week she had moved in, hoping to make friends, hoping to show people a good time. But as soon as the women arrived in slacks and casual dresses, Ava, in a tight, shiny violet dress, knew she had made a terrible mistake. She had decorated the backyard with candles and red Chinese lanterns. "Isn't this different?" one of the neighbors said through a forced smile. And Ava felt stung. She stacked up 45s on the record player so people could dance, but the only person who asked her was one of the husbands, and when she felt his hand slide low along her hip, she pulled away. "Any reason you might know for Jimmy to run away?" the cop asked. "He wouldn't run away," Ava said. The cop leaned forward. "Some people said you were a bit too close to Jimmy." Ava frowned. "He's my son's best friend," she said. "Would you say that he's your friend too?" "He's a boy, and I'm a grown woman. You can't possibly think." "I don't think anything. I'm just asking questions," said the cop. The cop cleared his throat. "Mrs. Lark," he said, "you've had boyfriends, a lot of different ones, people said. Who knows how well you really knew them?" "I knew them," she said. "I see," he said, "and you're divorced." "Why do you keep asking me about being divorced?" she said. "That's not a crime, and I'm allowed to date." "So these boyfriends, let's talk about them. How many were there?" "None of them would have touched Jimmy," Ava said. "Did I say that?" He wrote something down again. "Mrs. Lark, let's do this. How about you give me the names and numbers of all your boyfriends? We'll contact them. We'll ask them the questions. You don't have to do a thing." He nodded, still friendly. The faces swam up in her memory. Each name she wrote down conjured up little bits of things. Richard Meserve. She had met him getting gas for her car. John Blake. He brought her flowers every day, and then he had yelled at a waitress, and she didn't like that, so she stopped seeing him. But then they hadn't liked her. They didn't like her because she couldn't go out and stay out all night because she had to work in the morning. Ava wouldn't peel off her dress and get right down to her skivvies after a first date. Ava wasn't what they wanted, but they too had disappointed her. "Had any of your boyfriends met Jimmy?" "No." There were 5 names and then 6, 3 a year. That wasn't so many boyfriends. She didn't feel a single thing about any of them. The cop took the list and studied the names. "That's quite a list," he said. Okay, so that's it for the reading. So I want to talk a little bit about how I became a writer and how it came out of my being an outcast. Not only was I an outcast as a little kid, but I also had terrible asthma. So when my friends were out playing, I was in the library, and I did a whole lot of reading. And when I was reading, I wasn't that little Jewish kid with asthma. I was like a ballerina, or I was a doctor in Spain, or I was any number of things. But I didn't want to just read stories. I began to want to write them because I wanted to write stories about somebody like me. I wanted to authenticate who I was. So I started to write all these stories. And I remember one day the teacher was looking over my shoulder and she said, "Caroline, that's a really good story. You should read it to the class." And I said, "What, are you kidding? Everybody's going to make fun of me or they'll throw spitballs." And she said this really important thing to me. She said, "Sometimes you have to take a risk to do something that you want to do." So I stood in front of the class and I read my story, which was about an asthmatic little Jewish girl like me who was having some adventure at the zoo. And I noticed the class got really quiet and I noticed they were listening. And when I finished, they clapped and I said, "This is really cool. This is what I want to do." So from then on, I started making up stories whenever I could. I got through my whole high school never writing a book report about an actual book. What I would do is I would make up the book and then I would write a story about it. And I was never caught until my senior year when the teacher was so enamored of the book that I was writing about that she tried to track it down and she couldn't find it. And she didn't know whether to fail me because I lied about the book or to give me a good grade because I had been so creative. So I went on to college. I went to Brandeis. And I decided that I was going to take the hardest class there, which was a writing class taught by Alan Lelchuk. Now, he had 15 students in his writing class, and all of us were terrified of him. And in fact, one of the kids used to bring in a little jar of Valium that we'd pass around. First day of class, he said he was going to discuss my story, and I was so excited. But he took the story and he held it up like this. And he made a face like this. And he said, "Now we are going to discuss this garbage." The girl who was sitting next to me gasped. The guy on the other side went rigid. And I didn't know what to do. So I just sat there for the whole 40 minutes listening to Professor Lelchuk tear apart my prose and tell me that the characters were stupid, the plot was mundane, it was the worst thing he had ever read. Tears were coming down my face. I did a lot of crying back then, but I wouldn't leave. I kept coming back to that class every single day, even when there were only 3 of us left. And at the last day of class, I had a conference with him, and he said, Caroline, you're not going to make it. You don't have what it takes. And I said, you're wrong. I'm going to prove to you that I do. So I got out of college, and I was determined I was going to be a writer, and I started sending stories out. Now, when you send stories out, you send them out in these big brown envelopes that are self-addressed, so when they come back, you immediately know nobody wanted them. Most writers have to have other jobs. They can't just be writers. Now, a lot of writers can be things like doctors and lawyers and teachers, and they can still write, but I determined that I couldn't. So I quickly began to get the worst jobs possible, and I was fired from all of them. I was fired from my very first job in an answering service because I kept mixing up the emergency calls for Dr. Foote, the podiatrist, with Dr. Foote, the obstetrician, and people weren't very happy about that. I was fired from another job, which was called American Publishing Company. And I was so excited because I thought, oh, publishing has to do with writing. But I got there and it happened to be a puzzle factory. And they made obscene puzzles. And my job was to follow people around and learn all these big, terrifying machines. And I was there for 3 days when I began to notice that people were missing a lot of fingers. And they had a lot of injuries. The last day I was there, I heard the scream, and I looked over, and one of these other women, and they were all really, really young, she had her hair caught in the glue press, and it was pulling her down, and I was getting all upset and like asking people, like, aren't you going to do something? And somebody turned towards me and said, oh, that's Gina. That happens to her all the time. It's at least once a week. I thought, I can't work here. And they said, fine, you're fired, go home. So I went home really discouraged, thinking, well, now what am I going to do? What kind of a job can I possibly get? I'm fired from everything. And as soon as I got home, I saw it, the big brown self-addressed envelope that meant a rejection. And I was so disheartened that I ripped it up in a million pieces, like confetti, all over my front porch. And just as I was about to go inside, I happened to look down, and I saw among all those pieces of paper one word, and it said, congratulations. So I bent down, and I took all these pieces of paper, and I had to quickly put them together to see, what is this? What is this? What is this? And it turned out I had won a contest, a writing contest through Red Book magazine, and they were paying me $7,000 for a short story of mine, and they were going to get me an agent. And I was so excited. I thought, this is so great. This is so great. That became my first novel, Meeting Rosie Halfway. And when it came out, and I got my first great review from the New York Times, I sent the review and the book to Alan Lelchuk at Brandeis University with a note saying, I told you I would do it. He wrote back to me, and he actually said, well, I knew that you would. I was just trying to get you mad and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. But I just figured, no, you know what? It doesn't matter. So there I was, and I thought, oh, this is great. I'm a writer. But fate had other things in store for me. My first publisher went out of business. My second publisher went out of business. My third publisher went out of business right before the book came out. And all my books just... There was no sales, there was no promotion, there was nothing. So then I got signed to a really big publisher on a 3-book deal, and I thought, great, here's my career again. But no, they wouldn't take my calls. They would not answer my emails, and the book just died. So I was writing pictures of you for this major publisher, and I thought, well, this is going to be my big book. And I thought it was an okay book. And all of a sudden, my editor called me, and she said, Caroline, you know what? We're not going to publish this book. And I said, why not? And she said, well, we don't think it's special. And I said, really? Well, can I make it special? She said, no, we talked about it here at the company, and we don't think you can. And I said, well, what if I write another book? Do you think you'll look at that? And she said, we don't think your other book is going to be special either. So I hung up the phone and I thought, this is terrible. This is my 9th novel. Nobody knows who I am. When people asked me, what do you do for a living? I would always say, I'm a writer with a question mark. I thought, nobody knows who I am. My books aren't selling. I have reviews that are good reviews, but still, I've made enough money maybe to buy groceries for the week. So I remembered what that teacher had told me, that way back, that sometimes when you really want something, you have to swallow your pride and you have to just risk going out after it. So I called all my friends and I was crying. And I said, you know what, this is really humiliating, but my book was rejected. Nobody's going to want to publish me. I'm afraid my agent's going to drop me. What can I do? And one of my friends said, I have this editor at Algonquin Books. She might like this. Why don't you write me a paragraph of what the book is about and we'll see what happens. So I wrote a paragraph. 2 days later, she called me and said, my editor likes it. She wants to see the whole book. So I sent the whole book. Then this amazing thing happened. The editor called me. Now, no editor had called me or taken me to lunch or anything in 9 books. This editor called me and said, come on in. We want to buy the book. So I came in. Everybody from Algonquin was there, from the publisher to the marketing department to everybody, and they were all smiling at me. They said, we really love the book, and we're going to change your life. And I said, yeah, okay. Go ahead, see if you can, because I was used to just, my career going down, down, down. But they did something amazing. They actually kept their word. They took that non-special book. They got it into 6 printings 6 months before it came out. They got it onto the New York Times bestseller list, the USA Today bestseller list. It sold to 6 different countries. It was on the best books of the year list from all these places. But the truly funny thing that happens that shows you that there is karma is the day that it came out on the New York Times, I got an email from that editor who had rejected it as not being special enough. Only that email wasn't really for me. It was supposed to be to her doctor, and she was describing a really personal medical condition she had, and she wanted to know what the doctor was going to do about it. And I thought, well, what do I do about this? I don't want to be mean about this, and I don't want to embarrass her, but I sort of want her to know that I got on the New York Times bestseller list. So I decided to ignore it. And then she sent it again the next day, and she described her symptoms even more fully, and they were more personal and embarrassing. And I thought, well, maybe I should just tell her that I'm not her doctor. So I sent her an email. I said, hi, how you doing? Listen, I think you sent this email to your doctor to me. And she wrote me back and she said, oh, yeah, thank you for telling me. How are things going? And I wrote her back and I said, well, that book you rejected, it's on the New York Times bestseller list. And she never wrote me back. So, so you never know how those things work. One other thing that I just want to talk about is in terms of how writing this particular book actually healed a lot of things that went on in my childhood. When I was growing up, there was a whole lot of pain, being bullied and, being called all kinds of names for being Jewish. But in writing the novel, I had to take those people who did those things and try to think of them as full three-dimensional characters and what was going on in their lives to make them be that kind of person. And I came to understand them and to understand the paranoia they had and the fear and the kinds of things that would make somebody anti-Semitic and racist and paranoid and any number of things. And the more I understood those characters, the more I began to forgive them. And if not to forgive them, then at least to let it go and to heal it a little bit and to understand that they were very much a product of their times. And when you look at the 1950s and you look at today, you can see that while a lot has changed, a lot hasn't changed. All you have to do is take the word terrorist or Muslim and substitute it for the word communist, and you can get an idea of the kind of paranoia that was going on. Even in terms of women, Things are certainly much better for women, but still, I know in the literary world, men get most of the important reviews. And if a woman writes about domestic issues, her family or kids or anything like that, it's given this horrible term called women's fiction, which means that nobody but women would want to read it. But if a man does it, then he's Jonathan Franzen. So it's a totally different thing. But so anyway, I just want to end by saying that I hope that, in all the things that I've told you about, like my career and how I came all through this, if any of you have anything that you've ever really wanted to do and you have any doubts about doing it, you should just go ahead and be brave and do it. And, just consider me the poster girl of second chances. And I just want to thank you all very much for being here. This was just really a lot of fun for me, and it's just a pleasure to talk and be able to talk like this. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? The only thing I ask is if you have questions is you have to stand up and you have to talk in a big room voice because I never can hear when people are spread out. You can ask me anything. Or if you want to talk privately, you can also talk afterwards privately with me too.
When did your miseries end?
When did what end?
Miseries.
My what? Oh, the mysteries end? I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, wait, I have one more thing. I have to give a shout out. There's a really amazing author sitting right over there, Suzanne Palmieri or Suzanne Hayes. And her new book, I'll Be Seeing You, just got a huge ad in Sunday's New York Times, and it's a really great book. And her other book, The Little Witch of Italy, great book. Also, and the guy sitting next to her John is also a really talented writer, and we can expect his memoir in 2 years, right? Thank you so much.